So welcome. Thank you for joining us for Teens and Cannabis, a look at the data. I'm Jessica Bickford. I'm the coordinator of Healthy Lamoille Valley. And Healthy Lamoille Valley is a coalition of individuals and organizations that work collaboratively to reduce youth substance misuse and promote healthy substance-free activities for youth across the Lamoille Valley. We do this by working to increase protective factors and decrease risk factors using evidence-based practices that are rooted in years of prevention science. Now for a few quick housekeeping items. As we carry out the mission of Healthy Lamoille Valley, we're often asked to share data on how substances impact youth. This has been especially the case with legal retail cannabis markets coming to Vermont. We thought about this and decided that one of the best ways to do this was to seek out a leading data expert whose life work was immersed in public health data. We're grateful to John Searles and his willingness to present this evening. A formal introduction will soon follow. We are primarily grant funded and required to share demographic information back with our grant partners periodically. In a moment, I will drop a link in the chat of that demographic data, and it will be shared again at the end of the workshop. Also, thank you to Maya from Green Mountain Public Access TV for recording this workshop and making it available to those who can't be here this evening. The link will be sent out as soon as we have it. We'll send an email to all participants. It will also be posted on the Green Mountain Public Access website, as well as the Healthy Lamoille Valley website. Also, thank you to my coworker, Allison Link, for joining us tonight. Allison will be helping with some of the tech, managing the chat, as well as some Q&A. John will share his presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A at any time during the presentation, but do note that John will not answer those until we get to the end of the presentation, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. If you have local policy related questions, Allison is our policy and community outreach coordinator, and she will get back to you on those as well. So do drop those questions in the Q&A as well. At the end, I'll drop a brief evaluation survey in the chat, and we appreciate your time in filling that out as it helps to inform future programs. Before we welcome John, I'd actually like to introduce you to Michelle Salvador. She's the substance misuse prevention consultant for the Vermont Department of Health for our region. And she's going to share a few words and give a formal introduction to John, as she has had the privilege of working alongside John for many years. So Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, Jessica. Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight for this important and timely discussion. As Jessica said, I'm the substance prevention consultant for the Lamoille Valley for 24 years now. Tonight, we're going to learn about some health impacts of cannabis use, predominantly the health impact on youth. I want to share with you a bit about the focus of our statewide prevention efforts first and our local prevention efforts. Our prevention work is based in research and is driven by the risk and protective factor theory. This theory draws connections between risk factors and the protective factors that influence individuals' behaviors. The more protective factors that a young person has and the fewer risk factors that they experience, the higher the chance of preventing harmful behaviors such as substance use. But why are we so concerned about youth substance use? We are because research demonstrates that young people who use early in life, while the brain is still developing, have an increased likelihood that they will develop substance dependency in their lifetime versus someone who uses after the age of 21 or even 25 when the brain is done developing. We also know from research that while there are many risk factors, there are some risk factors that are strongly correlated with young people using early in life. Some of the most prominent risk factors in our community that drive early life use are the access and availability of substances in our communities, having community laws and community norms that support substance use, and when young people have a low perception of harm about using substances, and having family and friends that use substances and support use of substances. One important way that we address and impact these risk factors in our community is by sharing validated data. With all of the changes in our state, with cannabis legalization and the upcoming retail market, it's important to understand what the risk of harm is to young people so that we can work together to mitigate these risks. I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. John Searles, or Dr. Data, as I like to refer to him. I've had the honor of working with Dr. Searles over the years. He was a substance abuse research and policy analyst and chair of the State Epidemiological Workgroup for the Division of Alcohol and Drug Abuse Programs in the Vermont Department of Health. He retired in 2019, unfortunately, but he is currently an appointed member of the legislatively mandated Substance Misuse Prevention Advisory Council and serves on the council's Equity, Prevention, and Policy subcommittees. He has been on the faculty at University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Vermont. He has co-edited 2 books, Children of Alcoholics and Alcohol in the Family, and published over 50 scientific articles in the substance use and abuse field. John earned his doctorate in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Searles was a major contributor to the initial marijuana legalization health impact assessment published by the Vermont Department of Health in 2016, the principal author of the 2017 Health Impact Assessment Literature Review Update, and an advisor to the 2020 update, which you can find on our website at vermonthealth.gov. So without any further delay, welcome to Dr. John Searles.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and it's been a pleasure over the years. We've gotten to know each other pretty well, and we've discussed a lot of data over the years. So we're just going to continue our conversation here. So the first thing I want to say is that I am not speaking for the Department of Health. I don't work there anymore. This is my former position, as Michelle pointed out. So these are slides that are actually, some of them are old and some of them are brand new. Some of them are new as of today. So I like to dive into data. So let's do that. So we'll do the next slide. The questions to be addressed tonight will be, has cannabis legalization been shown to be safe for kids? Has cannabis use among adolescents changed following the legalization? And what are the risk factors that contribute to early use, and what are the implications of early and continuous use? As Michelle mentioned, there are the Department of Health published 3 literature reviews on the health effects of cannabis. Next. The first one was the health impact assessment that Shayla Livingston and I were principal authors on. And we determined that there was a real impact of early and sustained cannabis use that's associated with many social, physical, and neurological factors that are adverse effects that can stretch into adulthood. Next. Then we did an update of the literature review in 2017, which I was the principal author on, and found the same factors that we found in the first time. And then we also concentrated on the effects that cannabis on teens have on brain structure changes that may likely not be reversible, but that's still under research purview. And next. And then a couple of years ago, my successor did the health impact assessment literature review update for 2020, and I was an advisor on that. And there's a bonus because I also was involved in the governor's Marijuana Advisory Commission Education and Prevention Subcommittee, and we did a literature review for that committee as well in 2018. What we found, none, nada, zilch. Next. In no way, shape, or form or fashion did we find that cannabis was safe for kids. There are no published peer-reviewed studies that even remotely suggest that cannabis is safe for kids. In fact, we determined that the scientific literature comes to exactly the opposite conclusion. Not only is it safe for kids, but research has clearly and repeatedly determined that adolescent use of marijuana is extremely risky and can result in very serious long-term psychosocial, physical, and neurobiological adverse effects, especially when starting with early use, sustained use, and high potency. And we'll talk about all those subsequently. So this is a slide from Jonathan Calkins, and the question is really framed incorrectly. It's not why there hasn't been a rise in marijuana use, but rather why didn't youth marijuana use fall? And this is what he means. Everything, all the other substances over time, I know this slide stops in 2016, but we will update this as we go along. As you can see, alcohol, getting drunk, and cigarette use have all fallen, but marijuana use has pretty much stayed the same. So the question should be reframed as why didn't it fall, as opposed to why didn't it rise? And this is talking about potency. I want to bring to your attention the fact that the first circle on the left-hand side of the slide suggests what marijuana was like in the late 60s, early 70s. That's the potency, THC concentration. And what it is, the upper right-hand circle is this slide shows what it has come to right now. Actually, this was in 2016, I think, 2017. But then there was a study by Smart, which looked at 32 million cannabis transactions in Washington state and found that the average THC in the flower cannabis that was sold was greater than 20%, and in concentrates was greater than 68%. So this is not your father's or your grandfather's THC. And these are the percentages of CBD and THC in cannabis seizures from the DEA from 1995 to 2019. And the reason this is important is that higher ratios of THC to CBD impact the potency of the marijuana that's being used. That is, if there's a low amount of CBD and a high amount of THC, the potency is exacerbated. And as you can see, the ratio at this stage of the game is quite high. Well, there you go. Put scientifically, this is a title of an article. I won't read this for you, but this is what scientists call it. And this is another slide from Jonathan Calkins about dose size. So if you had one joint each weekend night prior to 2000, that's about 4.6 milligrams per day. The average daily user in Washington today, assuming 1.3 grams a day, 20% THC, that's 260 milligrams per day, which is 60 times as much THC. I hope I made the point about the fact that it's much more potent than it used to be. This is a slide that I probably shouldn't have included, but despite what Michelle said, I decided to do it anyway. So if you click once more, Jessica, that's the purple line arrow is the reported intoxication. That is how intoxicated individuals felt. All right, click it again. The yellow line is how confused they felt. Once more. The red line is the actual amount of THC in the blood. Once more. And that's the placebo response. So you can see over 2 hours after individuals were administered THC, they still had a very high level of confusion and felt intoxicated compared to placebo. And why do I bring this up? Well, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Because, you know, you can start getting a driver's license when you're 16 years old in Vermont and most of the country. And I just wanted to make the point about THC is a contributing factor to fatalities. These data I'm going to show you come from Washington and from Colorado. This is from Colorado. You can see that when marijuana was legalized for recreational use, that the number of fatalities of drivers testing positive went up, and their per se rate is 5 milligrams, which we don't have to talk about now, but that may or may not be accurate. That's like a per se rate of 0.08 for alcohol. Next slide. This is the state of Washington in the same vein, and that is to say that when Initiative 502, which went into effect in 2012, you can see that the percentage of all drivers involved in fatal crashes in Washington state increased substantially. I don't have this broken down by age because I haven't been able to find that, but nonetheless, you can see that the correlation between the association between when legalization was passed and what happens subsequently is dramatic. And this is from the AAA. I'm not going to read the whole slide, but the bottom line is that there's a lot of studies that demonstrate that marijuana use impairs cognitive and physical function. It varies by individual. We know that as well. But the bottom line here is that marijuana and driving is not a good combination. Marijuana and alcohol and driving is a much worse combination. You can leave that up for people to read if they want, or you can just go to the next slide. This is the past 30-day marijuana use in Vermont and the United States comparison. This is from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health from 2018, 2019. That's how state level data are released. And as you can see that Vermont in all age categories is significantly greater than the United States. And in fact, in most categories, in this case, in 2018 and 2019, I think all categories, Vermont was the highest state with the highest prevalence. Now, the next slide shows the newest data. Nope, go back one. And you'll notice that there's a decrease in the 12 to 17, although we still lead the pack in all age groups. We're tied with Oregon for 12 to 17, but you may also notice that for the 18 and 25-year-olds, it went up over 2018, 2019. We're going to talk about that reduction in a bit with some other data. So you can go ahead and go on. And this is just a comparison looking at the 30-day alcohol consumption and binge drinking for underage youth aged 12 to 20 in the United States. This is 2018, 2019. Again, we're significantly greater than the United States. And go to the next slide, which is 2019, 2020. Same situation, nothing changed like it did with marijuana. I hate to go through these slides so fast because I'm sure, but well, anyway, I won't apologize. Perception of risk is an important factor because the lower the perception of risk, that typically leads to a higher usage. And this is data from 2015, 2016. And these are two perception of risks categories, one for drinking 5 or more drinks 1 or 2 times a week, and smoking marijuana once a month. Both those categories, the perception of risk in Vermont is significantly lower than in the United States. And I will go to the next slide and show you the current data. And as you can see, the perception of risk did not change much for the alcohol section, but dramatically dropped for smoking marijuana once a month, which we're going to revisit this in some other data later on. And again, both these numbers are significantly less in Vermont than they are across the United States. This is substance use disorder in the past year in Vermont and the US. This is quite concerning. We're dramatically different in all age groups from United States. And then we'll look at the next slide, which is the data from just 2020. You'll see that these numbers have jumped both for Vermont and the United States. There's a good reason for this. The previous data from 2018, 2019 were based on the DSM-4 criteria. That's a psychiatric criteria. And these data for 2020 are based on 2005. And that's something of significance because the DSM-4 had substance abuse and dependence. The DSM-5 has substance use disorder, mild, moderate, or severe. So it's more encompassing in terms of identifying individuals with substance use problems. Oh yes, the good news. Well, this is awesome. So next slide. Well, kind of good news. I forgot to mention that. Go ahead. So this is a Monitoring the Future study, which is done every year by the University of Michigan. And as you can see, I can't see the end of the slide because of the pictures in the way. But as you can see, there was a pretty interesting drop off in prevalence, in 30-day prevalence for 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the most recent survey. And next slide. Same is about pertains to vaping trends in the past 12 months, 8, 10, and 12. Looks like a tremendous success. Next slide. Vaping marijuana also has dropped off. Now, I wonder what happened in 2020 and 2021 that could possibly have accounted for this, other than Michelle and her colleagues' good work. Well, I think there's a thing called the pandemic, and kids were at home, didn't have access to their friends at school, and some of those friends may have been other things other than friends. So this is not definitive, but it certainly fits the data that we know. And there's some other things that I'll show you. Go ahead, next slide. Well, okay, this will help explain what I just said. The availability, that is 12th graders who said that these substances were fairly easy or very easy to get. So marijuana, alcohol, marijuana in 2019, 2000 and 2021, significant drop. Alcohol, another significant drop. Cigarettes, go ahead. And e-liquid, which is where the high potency of vaping comes in. As you can see, the availability was significantly curtailed from 2019 to 2021. Again, I think there are good reasons for that, and that's the pandemic and not being able to get out and go to school. Next. No. Okay, well, I must have done this twice. Sorry about that. I must have really liked this slide. I must have liked it a lot. I thought I'd taken care of this, but apparently not. Sorry, thank you. This is cocaine, and that has gone down. Heroin, dramatically dropped. Other narcotics, dramatically dropped. And here's the interesting one. Tranquilizers, the availability, fairly easy or very easy to get, went up. I'm not even going to comment on that. I'm going to let you chew on that one. Yeah, well, it's not all good news from the Monitoring the Future. This is the trends in 30-day prevalence of daily use among college students versus non-college youth 1 to 4 years beyond high school. That is, these are peers. As you can see, there's a dramatic and significant difference, growing difference between college students and non-college students of the same age. I'd also like to point out that, well, I'll just skip that for now. Again, this is the Monitoring the Future study. Next slide. This is the perceived harmfulness of use of marijuana regularly from 12th graders. Again, I want to point out that perceived risk, perceived harmfulness is a indicator of subsequent increased use, and that dropped dramatically as well. I did want to mention something about big tobacco and marijuana because I think it's very significant and very concerning. These are headlines that I picked out from the web. Big Tobacco is already eyeing pot. Tobacco giant Altria is securing technology and new frontiers, marijuana. Why cannabis is part of the future of big tobacco. Big Tobacco is coming for legal marijuana. And you may or may not know that Altria, which used to be Philip Morris, purchased Juul for $12.8 billion a couple of years ago. And they're also developing their own nicotine vape products as well. And this is one of the reasons I'm concerned. This is a study of the effects of the legalization of recreational marijuana on the sales of cigarettes. This is new and very interesting to me that they looked at the sales of cigarettes attributed, and they parsed this so that they could figure out which was attributable to legalization by two different methods. And the bottom line is that legalizing recreational use of marijuana is associated with an increase in cigarette consumption by about 7%. That should terrify you. Next. These results have tremendous implications for both public health and the tobacco industry. And, this goes against all we know about what's been happening in the tobacco in public health and cigarettes and tobacco in youth, which is it's been going down because of the great work of the prevention people in tobacco. And I want to remind you, if you forgot how predatory big tobacco can be, these are from older headlines, but go ahead. You can just keep doing this. That's my favorite one. They are not nice people. Okay. I'm going to talk about this briefly because of the claims that have been made about medical marijuana. Ted Caputi wrote this article called Medical Marijuana, It's Not Miracle Marijuana. And I'm going to summarize it with his words. Go ahead. One study showed that alcohol sales decreased 15% in medical marijuana legal states compared to non-medical marijuana legal states. And if you look at these data, that would suggest that that's 8 to 9 fewer drinks, not dinks, but drinks per day per user, which is silly. They're also associated with a reduction in obesity and obesity-related health costs, which translates to 45 pounds per user. And my favorite, 10 to 20% reductions in Medicare prescriptions for anxiety, depression, pain, psychosis, and spasticity. Just to remind you, 90% of Medicare Part D recipients are age 65 plus. 3% of all Medicare recipients use marijuana for medicinal purposes. They are talking savings in the billions of dollars, which is patently silly. It's another study that I found from 2018 that goes against what has been just suggested, that medical marijuana users are more likely to use prescription drugs medically and non-medically. Here's just a summary of what they found. This is from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health data. A much higher risk for prescription drug and specifically non-medical prescription drug use than, I can't read the other part of the slide, but you can read it yourself. Go ahead. More of the same. This is disturbing, and in the next couple of slides, I'm gonna show you again why that is. Okay. This study published in 2014 got a tremendous amount of attention because it suggested that states with medical cannabis laws had a almost 25% lower rate of overdose mortality rates from opioids. This was really caused quite the stir. Okay. This is a study that was done, published a couple years later, looking at the same data, using the same kind of analysis, but taking it out a couple years later, and found that the overdose mortality rate in those states had actually reversed over time, and reversed from 21% to 23%, remained positive after accounting for recreational marijuana laws. And I bolded this last statement because this is the most important point, and the point I tried to make on the previous slides, which is we find it unlikely that medical cannabis used by about 2.5% of the US population has exerted large conflicting effects on opiate overdose mortality. More plausible interpretation is that this association is spurious. This is why we have to evaluate the research that comes out. And this is the slide from that study, which shows until 2010, you can see the dotted lines are not important here. It's the solid black line. The dotted lines are confidence intervals, but you can see on the original study that it actually did decrease, but the new study showed how dramatically it increased over time. Why longitudinal research is critically important? This is one of my favorite quotes from one of my most unfavorite people, but it does capture essentially why research is really crucial, and we can't make decisions about things that on the spur of the moment, or something comes out this month and we have to have data from next month. It takes years and years to collect data to show the adverse or even positive impacts of policy change. So you can go to unknown unknowns essentially equals unintended consequences. And the next couple of slides, the reason I say this is the next couple of slides I want to show you is studies that were published late last year, and to show you that it takes time to collect data, and it takes time to analyze data, and sometimes even years later, we get things like this. Go ahead. And this is a study that was published in November of 2021 that showed, go ahead, just keep, you're good, yeah. 322 mother-child pairs. The children were assessed at age 6. And here we go. This is the bottom line. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the bottom line is that there's so much misinformation that marijuana is of no risk. While reality is that it's the potency today is so much greater than it was, as the slides I showed you earlier, that using it during pregnancy can have a long-term impact on children. There are studies that are being conducted now with even the longer term, and haven't been the data haven't been all collected yet. So that's why I talked about how crucial longitudinal and long-term studies are. That we can't make decisions based on a short period of time. That it takes time to collect data and analyze it and publish it. Okay. There's another study that came out in September of 2021. Go ahead. A large sample and a history of myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, was more frequent among recent cannabis use relative to non-users. Adjusted odds ratios of 2.07, which means they were twice as likely to have a heart attack. Okay. All right, well, here's the bottom line. Research has demonstrated clearly and repeatedly that marijuana use in adolescents can have serious short and long-term adverse effects. It's especially significant for developing brain structures and functions. As Michelle said, the young brain is not really mature until age 25. This is data that's coming out now that's very concerning. It may exacerbate or accelerate the development of psychosis in vulnerable individuals. And this is a study that was recently published suggesting that consistent evidence from observational experimental studies has essentially confirmed the important role of cannabis use in initiation and persistence of psychotic disorders. I don't want to overstate this because psychosis in the population is relatively rare still, but there are data coming in that suggests that it's increasing, and it's increasing most among cannabis users, mostly because of the high potency of today's cannabis. So the bottom line, in my judgment, is that cannabis is not safe for kids. Okay. And if you're not bored to tears like my cat Finn, I'm happy to take questions, have comments, and have a discussion about this.
Okay, we're going to switch over to the comments. So here's one for you. While it is true that today's marijuana is much more potent than, say, in the 1970s, wouldn't smoking less of today's weed be equivalent to smoking more of the old weed?
But sure. I'm not sure that's not even, I wouldn't think that's controversial. That's just a math problem, right? You smoke less of today's weed and more of the old weed, you're still gonna, if you have the equivalent amount of THC in your system, I'm gonna rethink this because I just realized what I was saying.
Right. Think about too, if you can explain the change of CBD versus THC, because I think that's another important point.
Exactly. And I'm gonna take that all back because I don't know how much of with a 1% THC over time would probably not be as adverse and neurologically concerning as 20 to 30%, much less 70% in concentrates. And as Michelle said, there's also a widening gap between the CBD and THC ratio, which would contribute to even more potency and higher adverse effects.
Thank you, John and Michelle. The next one is, I think, addressing the point that CBD counteracts Delta-9 THC is important to speak a little more about. It can really help individuals who accidentally take too much in an unregulated market. It's very common, especially with edibles. Taking CBD helps to counteract that. So I think that was that ratio that you were talking about of how much CBD was in the plant. And that's good for folks to know. So I think that was more of a statement than a question. The next one is, can you speak more about the effects of retail markets on youth?
I'm not sure I understand that question. You talk about legalization. That's what essentially that is the retail market, right? Unless you're talking about unregulated retail markets.
If the individual who wrote that wants to write to the host and panelists to clarify that question, that would be great. The next one is, what is the most effective prevention strategy so far developed, given the understanding of that Vermont clearly has, why clearly has, I think is one part of the question. Why is the problem in Vermont continuing and not decreasing?
Michelle?
I know, I'm looking, I was starting to answer it in the chat. So let's see. So the most effective prevention strategy is not one strategy. Effective substance misuse prevention is multiple strategies, and individual strategies and community strategies all the way up to our environment. So there is no one thing that's going to work. And as I discussed earlier, the most effective prevention is reducing the risks that are associated. So for example, John showed some data on when you decrease access, then rates go down. When you increase access and availability, rates go up. So our work is very specific to the risk factors that are strongly correlated with use. I'm trying to see the rest of the question. The thing keeps moving here. So given the level understanding that Vermont clearly has, why is the problem in Vermont? Okay. I mean, that's easy. We're really not funded. So the industry spends a lot more money marketing toward people, toward young people. Our community laws and norms generally support use in Vermont. We have an economy that relies on substances, and we have absolutely no state funding to support substance prevention. The only prevention funding that we currently have in Vermont is federal funding. And the federal funding comes like, here's a grant and you work on some strategies, and 2 years later, the grant goes away. So our research and our data shows that as we sustain prevention dollars and we sustain our efforts, then we do make an impact in use rates. But we don't have long-term sustainable measures all the time, or consistent measures or strategies because of the funding issues, and because of the funding issues. I hope that helps.
Let me just add to that, Michelle, about the
Sure.
Strategic Prevention Framework grant that was, I think, 5 to 7 years. And when that was evaluated, it showed tremendous impacts of the prevention efforts in Vermont on those places that received the funds. And those that did not have the impact. So prevention funding is crucial. And as Michelle said, it's never been a state issue. It's never been a priority for the state. It's always come in federal funds, which again, they're ups and downs to federal funding.
I see another question that's right under that. Catherine Crawley is asking about the norming. And again, that is another significant, I mean, it is such a huge risk factor, is when our norms in our communities support use, then we see the perception of harm change for young people, and we see their first age of use decrease. So the more we have events with alcohol, with cannabis, with substances, the more we incorporate it. I do this slideshow where I actually follow my own son's life and every year of his life so far, and I highlight for folks every year how he was impacted by the constant messaging that to use, and that use is fine and use is normed, and all of those messages add up. And when we have a lot of norming like that and we have increased access, then it just clearly translates into young people using during that critical period of brain development.
Also, thank you, Michelle. We have another one here. In the study of fatal accidents in Washington, do you know what amount of THC qualified for the study?
I do not know, but okay. I do know, as I pointed out, that the average quantity of THC of the 32 million that were assessed in that study was over 20% in flower and over 68% in concentrates. So no doubt it was substantial.
And that first question was talking about legal retail markets and the impact of those on youth and what the data shows. So legal retail was the answer to that first question.
I think, as Michelle just said, anytime access is increased, use goes up. That's across all substances. There's some studies that have been done in Europe about increasing access to alcohol when all the states in the European Union had to lower their prices. I think this study was done, I could be wrong, but I think it was done in one of the Nordic countries, that their prices went down and hospitalizations subsequent associated with high alcohol use increased dramatically in the next couple of years. So access and use are tied together.
Okay, here's one. Don't think this one has been asked. Since access seems to correlate with usage, what recommendations do you have for reducing access for teens in an environment where retail marijuana sales are illegal?
I'll give that one to Michelle as well.
I don't think I want that one, John. I don't have an answer. Retail, I think I would turn that one over to the measures. There is the Cannabis Control Board, and they are addressing and trying to, set up regulations in order to make sure when retail establishments occur that there are regulations in place that help mitigate the risk to young people. I don't really have anything other.
No. I think that's important, and I also should point out that the Cannabis Control Board in Vermont, headed by James Peppers, is probably the best in the country in terms of what we want to get out of it in terms of prevention, and as close as we can to find a group of individuals who understand the issues around increased access to youth.
If I could jump in for a second. Hi, everyone. Allison, also from Helping the Lamoille Valley. So I know the person who wrote that question is also on a local planning commission. And so I think there are folks who are thinking about local regulations and additional pieces that is not part of this conversation, but we can also follow up with you at another time. Things like outlet density matter, things like the marketing, things like buffer zones. There are lots of other prevention measures on that community level that reduce the norming and the youth access and availability, and the youth will impact the perception. So just wanted to add some of that in here on the policy level.
And advertising as well, advertising restrictions.
And the advertising, for sure.
Thank you, Allison. There's a question here that looks like it didn't get finished. So if that is you, go ahead and put that back. It starts with 0.05 nanograms per deciliter, but then it doesn't really finish. So if that was your question, please go ahead and retype that. There's a question here. What did the state of Colorado have to do to their labeling after they legalized a retail market?
It's not my purview. I can only tell you that they jumped in with both feet and started from scratch. I have seen some presentations on what they did. Actually, had somebody from Washington and from Colorado who's associated with the health departments there come and say essentially present what kind of measures that they had to, and hoops they had to jump through, and measures they had to provide, but they started from day one, so we're at least a little bit ahead of that. I don't have all the details about that, but part of this has to do with packaging, warning labels on packaging, how much like I think it's 10 milligrams per unit they can have. I forget all the gory details, but they have a lot of data on their own websites that you can check for.
Yeah, and I think that is important to note that Colorado did go back and look at their labels and put some stronger warnings there. And we can certainly find that and send that out to folks when we send the follow-up email. But yeah, that's so there's another question.
That relates to the famous Maureen Dowd story from the New York Times when she went to Colorado and had a cookie, and I think it was 100 milligrams, and she wasn't aware of that, and she got pretty stoned and wrote about that in one of her stories. And I think subsequent to that, they changed the labeling and the packaging to account for the fact that maybe one cookie is 10 servings as opposed to one serving.
Which is actually really concerning for our kids, and we need to really send a strong messaging to adult legal users about how they store these products in their home, and making sure that they reduce, or not reduce, but fully restrict that access to children and teens. Here's another question. Prevention efforts involve a data problem. The effects of your investment are things that don't happen. How do you measure what doesn't happen?
Well, hopefully you look for reductions in the metrics that you're measuring. increases are a bad thing, reductions are a good thing in substance use and abuse.
This one might be for Michelle. What programs do you know of that attempt to find out from those in recovery programs what would have prevented them from ending up struggling?
So John can probably help me to cite specific data sources, but it's not necessarily programs, but it's data collection. So we have the BRFSS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey System.
Yes.
We have the NISDA data. There's a lot of data that is collected nationally, and the questions are asked about, when people started using, and it's really from that the data has shown us people with substance use disorder and early life use. John, do you want to elaborate? I'm not sure if I was.
No, I think that's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
That there are early use and sustained use is a very serious problem in any substance, and we're just getting to. Just think about cigarettes. Just because everybody used to smoke back in the good old days, and that had severe consequences that the tobacco industry decided to sweep under the rug. And that I hate to. I'm sorry. I'm going to riff on this a little bit because I mentioned the tobacco information in my presentation because this is going to be big cannabis in not a good way. These are people who are out to make money and to make money any way possible. And that is to selling as much and as often as they can to people who will buy. And some of those markets are youth markets, as we know from the tobacco industry. It's not going to change.
I also want to add that I have been in the field, both the treatment and the prevention field, for about 30 years. And I always ask people, right? So this is very anecdotal, but I always ask people about their early use or their use, how their involvement with substances. And I would tell you, everyone that I know that is in recovery or has issues with substance use disorder all talk about using before the age of 15, and oftentimes before beginning use before the age of 13. And the data also supports that. And I want to point out that while we use this work from this risk and protective factor theory, we also work from a public health model. So a lot of our approaches are environmental approaches, access and availability, the community laws and norms. But these are not the only risk factors. So there are risk factors. A lot of folks have early childhood trauma. They come from families where there are substance use issues. And there are so many risk factors. We also know that there are people that come from really challenging situations that somehow had a lot of protective factors and did not end up with substance use issues or initiating substance use. So we're always studying, how do we balance out addressing the risk factors, but also being sure that we provide a lot of protective factors to young people in our communities.
So there's a follow-up. There's actually several that just came in. So following up to what you just shared, Michelle, are you talking about early use of substances in general or use of cannabis?
I'm talking about using any substances during brain development.
Okay.
Cannabis, alcohol, any nicotine, vaping, any substance.
Okay. As a follow-up question, or actually not a follow-up, but as another question, the Vermont Cannabis Control Board is trying hard to control that aspect, big marijuana, and limiting licenses to only small businesses. Will that help?
Yes.
Yeah. And as a follow-up to that, we've had the opportunity to have some conversations with some of our local smaller retailers that are interested in getting into this field. What advice would you have for them to help reduce risks for youth in the community? Because they've articulated that they really don't want their products to be for youth. So how can they, as retailers, help in that situation?
Well, not being a marketer or a business person, I don't feel qualified to answer that question, except to say to not specifically market to that age group. I mean, that's all I've got for that. I just don't have the expertise in that area.
And I would add just some clear messaging to your legal customers about safe storage and not supplying it to youth, because even with alcohol, we know that a lot of the youth who are getting it are not getting it from the stores. They're getting it from somebody who is of legal age to purchase that, whether it's a direct handoff or a procurement on their own. So if you have these substances in your home, storing them well and not providing to youth. Okay.
Let me just add something to that, because something I didn't put in the presentation was in early data from Washington and Colorado showed that pediatric emergency visits because of ingestion of marijuana significantly and dramatically increased after the legalization. And that's precisely because of what you just said, which is people are not taking care to keep it safely out of the hands of even babies.
Yeah. Good point. Here's another follow-up or another question. How much money would Vermont need to invest in order to change its position from top of the use list or bad list to halfway down? How much more, or how much money sustained for how long to move our ranking?
I have no idea.
None. I don't know either. I would say that having to write prevention grants every couple of years is exhausting, and is not, I mean, I don't know how many prevention coalitions come into being, and then after the funding ends, they're gone.
Right. I mean, we used to have 26, John.
Yeah.
So we don't have 26 anymore because of funding issues. And that's what I was thinking as well, is it's really, I don't think I can put it's too big of a question. I can't put a dollar figure on it, but the important thing is to sustain the groups that exist, the community prevention coalitions, to do the work. So you get I mean, like, right now, Healthy Lamoille Valley has some funding, but there was a grant they weren't sure about whether it would continue or whether it would change. That was $80,000. That is a significant portion of the budget. And I think the other important thing is that the prevention work needs to happen throughout the whole community. So you can have a budget and staff, and what would be great if there was the funding to sustain that over the long term, that it wasn't based on these short little blips of money. But it really is about all the people in the community being involved in the prevention work, not just the coalition, but what work is the select board doing around policies in town to maybe limit, you're having a family. I went to a family event once, and it was like a pumpkin slinging or something like this. And right next to the beer tent was the tent where you dropped off your kids to play with, like, sand toys. So I think looking at those types of constructs within our community together, and that can't happen as just the coalition staff. So it needs to be a really community, but it's a great question. I'll think about it. And
How about as much money as the tobacco companies put into advertising and marketing?
Okay, here is another one. What is the best current resource available for teenagers who are looking for help from a substance use disorder? I'm going to drop in the chat. Brian, our youth coordinator, has been working on a resource page. We recommend, checking in with your pediatrician because they have a relationship with your youth. But also, there are a lot of really awesome counselors and clinicians in our region. And so we can make some recommendations. But we also, Brian's created this resource for youth resources that's just rolling out as we speak. So there's some good stuff there, and follow-up will send some as well. We are starting to be nearing the end of time. So we're going to ask another question, and then I'm also going to drop the survey in the chat. We will send follow-ups as well. In your opinion, what kind of impact could legal retail cannabis have on the illegal Black market?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And there are some data on that in California and in Oregon, I believe. And I'm speaking from my memory now, so don't take this to the bank. Legal markets have impacted the illegal markets. That's prices have gone down because it has to, they need to be competitive. But there still is a huge Black market in all states that have legal marijuana. I'm sorry, I don't have any specific information on that. I can probably do that and get back to you and I'll give you some. I'll give something to Jessica and Michelle, and they can distribute that. But it's an excellent question.
Good. Thank you. And one of our attendees also just posted the vermonthelplink.org as being a great resource, and that is on that youth resource page as well. So that is certainly a great state resource for finding help in your community. So I did just drop the survey and the noms, and we are at 8 o'clock. So I want to be respectful of people's time. John is happy to stay for a few more minutes to catch a few of these last minute questions, but we also want to recognize that if you need to leave, we appreciate your time. There's so much here. There's so much to unfold. And we'll send some more resources as well in our follow-up email. With that in mind, here's another question. In the situation where prevention is the task of loosely affiliated organization, how are strategy and tactics coordinated consistently over time? Many of these groups are volunteer armies. I'll go ahead and actually take that question. We have, there's the prevention science, and so often coalitions, if you have funding, there are grants, whether it's the Vermont Department of Health or CDC with our Drug-Free Communities grant, and there's a lot of training with that. And they recognize in that as you mobilize people around a strategic goal and looking at the data, then you can do great work. And that no one person holds prevention and no one organization holds prevention. And so it's really, just casting that net wide so lots of people can hold it. There's at least 12 different sectors. We have youth, we have parents, we have businesses, we have, medical healthcare providers and mental health providers, law enforcement, education partners, municipal town leaders, business partners. And if we all come together strategically, civic organizations, and the list can kind of go on. If we all come together strategically, the recovery community, then we can do some really impactful work over time. And we do have the strategic prevention framework and those prevention the Vermont prevention model, where people like you can work at the individual level, and you can work at the organizational level, and you can work at the community level and the policy level. And each level you go up, it has broader impact. So that's why it's so important to have strong public health policy, is because that really impacts many of our community members. And so while the individual is important, and each kind of level you go up, you're impacting more people. And recovery is really we have really great recovery partners in our region, in our community, with a recovery center and Jenna's Promise. And, recovery is really a form of prevention, right? Because you're helping that individual, and then you're helping the generations of family members that are going to benefit from that. So hopefully I answered that well, but it's really mobilizing people. So
that was very well put.
And there is somebody put a link in the chat. We'll look at that and get that back. Okay, actually, this is from one of our VDH partners. Thank you, James, for posting that in the chat. I will post that to the broad audience. It's the answer to the illegal markets question. So it's there for everyone. There's a lot of thank yous in the chat. So thank you for joining us. And okay. Also, somebody would like me to share that the Vermont Medical Society urges that Vermont Cannabis Control Board, local cannabis control boards, and the Vermont legislature to require prominent labeling of all cannabis. It's really hard to read in the chat. Products with up-to-date evidence-based warnings, which should include may cause psychosis, impaired driving, addiction, suicidal attempts, uncontrollable vomiting, harm to fetus and nursing babies. This can occur in individuals with no previous history of psychosis or mental illness. And I think that ties into the warning labels that are on the Colorado. I think those are very similar, if I recall. So are there any last minute questions for John before we call it a night? So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Please visit healthylamoillevalley.org. We have a lot of resources there. That is where these materials will live after this evening. Thank you both to John, Michelle, Green Mountain Public Access, and Allison for fielding questions and recording tonight. And thank you. And
I just wanted to say, Jessica, too, folks can also feel free to follow up with me. My email address is, I don't know if everybody can see the chat or not, but it's michelle.salvador, SALVADOR @vermont.gov. Happy to take any of your questions afterwards or connect with you about our local prevention efforts.
I just dropped that in the chat. So.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye.
We look forward to future conversations.
Bye. Thank you, John.
Yep.
Thank you.